The COVID-19 pandemic in Africa still constitutes an extraordinary event, a public health risk to countries through international spread, and continues to require a coordinated international response. The outbreak of this deadly virus has taken a huge effect on all sectors and industry ranging from health, economy, technology. The emergence of new coronavirus variants has raised major questions around whether currently available vaccines will be effective against them and how accessible the vaccines will be to African countries. Joining me now is Professor Kingsley Moghalu, who is currently on a special assignment for the United Nations Development Programme as the UNDP Special Envoy on post-COVID development finance for Africa, and also a one-time presidential candidate in Nigeria. Good to have you join me, Professor Moghalu.
Thank you for having me.
So, looking at what's happening, ravaging the world and even the continent, how do you think Africa has fared so far since the outbreak of this virus?
Well, overall, I don't think Africa has fared very well since the outbreak of COVID. Let's step back a little bit and get a sense of the statistics. The global cases for COVID now, about 107 million people infected worldwide, and about 2.3 million people have already died. In Africa, the infected people, numbers of people, are 3.6 million. That's about 3% of global infection rates. So from a health standpoint, COVID has not been as devastating in Africa as it has been in other parts of the world. But when you look at the financial and economic impact of COVID, it is horrendous. The continent has fared very poorly because most of its countries have not been able to respond to the economic impact of the pandemic, especially the lockdowns early in the pandemic, in the second quarter of last year, have wiped out huge economic productivity in the continent. And many African countries do not have the fiscal resources to be able to provide the sort of stimulus support that developed countries have been able to provide to their citizens. This is where Africa has fared very poorly. And of course, even in the health sector, the weakness of our health sector in many countries has been exposed very significantly. So I don't think Africa has fared very well. It is a big problem for Africa, a huge crisis, but I shudder to imagine if the health impact of COVID in African countries were what it is in Western countries, what Africa would look like today. So we have not responded very well. I saw a ranking of the response of various countries, and I saw that countries like Rwanda, countries like Tunisia, countries like Togo are ranked highly in terms of their response. But the big countries like South Africa, like Nigeria, their response has not been very, very effective.
We'll come back looking at these, sorry to cut you there, we'll come back looking at these big countries. But again, a couple of African countries, inclusive, those you have mentioned, have released inflation figures from Egypt to Nigeria, as well as Kenya and South Africa. What is this recovery rate like, for these countries, looking at the numbers?
You mean in terms of recovery, in terms of those who are sick and have gotten better?
Absolutely.
Yes, I mean, the recovery rates have been very decent, at least 60 to 70% of recoveries, because out of the total number of cases in Africa, which is less than 2 million, I think. South Africa has a total number of cases of 1.4. We find that the death rates have not been so high, in many of these countries. Less than 100,000 people throughout the continent have died as a result of COVID. So that means that the recovery rates are fairly significant, if I were to put it that way.
You know, now we're talking about vaccine, and we're going back to the big countries which you mentioned. Is Africa considering local production of its own vaccines?
Well, some countries I know are thinking about it, but it's coming very late in the day. I mean, they should have been thinking about local production of vaccines a year ago. And instead, which is the tragedy for the continent in terms of its development, the continent's response was to look to the external, economically advanced countries for support, both financially, especially from the IMF and the World Bank. They have had to raise about $60 billion of support for various parts of the continent, including bilateral support as well. So what COVID has shown, one of the biggest lessons of COVID is the weakness of state capacity in Africa. Otherwise, many African countries, including Nigeria and South Africa, should by now have been close to, if not having produced, their own vaccines.
You know, talking about production of vaccine, let's come back to Nigeria. That's your country. There's something brewing now, which is around COVID, providing vaccines for countries. And now, at the moment, private sector initiative putting resources together. For instance, Boa Company that has paid over ₦1 billion to procure 1 million vaccine. But the talk in Nigeria is that the company has no right to get in 1 million vaccines for the populace. How does it sit well, knowing full well that you're one of the few African practical economists today?
Well, like I said before, the total absence of state capacity in many countries has been exposed by the COVID pandemic. And we have seen in some of the larger countries like Nigeria, the private sector stepping forward in a very muscular way. And, if the government accepts the help of the private sector to procure vaccines from countries that have already manufactured it, I really don't see the problem with that. The overriding necessity is to vaccinate as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. Right now in Nigeria or in many African countries, vaccinations have become a status symbol. The wealthy people, the political leaders, some of them who have connections internationally, they've gone abroad and taken vaccines. And that just tells you how sad the situation is for many citizens who are just average on the continent, who have nowhere to go and no hope of these vaccines if the government does not bring them in quickly within the next 3 or 4 months. So I don't see what's wrong with a private sector support for the acquisition of vaccines to the extent that the response of the government has not been robust enough.
Professor Kingsley Moghalu, many thanks for your time.
You're very welcome.